Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fighting Bunch, The Battle of Athens and How World War II Veterans Won the Only Successful Armed Rebellion Since the Revolution, by Chris DeRose, narrated by David Vries. A note on names. The Americans who settled the lands beyond the eastern seaboard, predominantly from the border region of Scotland and England, joined siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, and other members of their extended families. Generations later, people with the same last name, even an uncommon name, and even in a small county, are not necessarily closely related and may not even know one another. Players. The Fighting Bunch. Bill White, Marine Corps. Bill Grubb, Navy. Gene Gunter, Marines. David Hutzel, Army. Cecil Kennedy, Navy. Buck Landers, Army. Jimmy Lockmiller, Marines. Ken Mashburn, National Guard. Edgar Miller, Army. Thomas Shamblin, Army. Sam Sims, Navy. Edsel Underwood, Army. Millard Vincent, Army. Paul Weeks, Army. The Machine. Paul Cantrell, Sheriff of McMinn County and later State Senator, Chairman of the McMinn County Court and Chairman of the McMinn Democratic Party. Pat Mansfield, Chief Deputy Sheriff and later Sheriff. George Woods, State Representative and later Speaker of the Tennessee House. Minnis Wilburn, Deputy Sheriff of McMinn County. Birch Biggs, Boss of neighboring Polk County. Carl Neal, Game Warden. The GI Ticket. Ralph Duggan, Lieutenant Commander, U.S. Navy, lawyer, lead strategist for the GI Ticket. Otto Kennedy, Chairman of the McMinn Republican Party and owner of S&K Tire. Jim Buttram, Campaign Manager, GI Ticket. Knox Henry, GI Candidate for Sheriff. Frank Carmichael, GI Candidate for Trustee. George Painter, GI Candidate for County Court Clerk. Bill Hamby, GI Candidate for Clerk of the Circuit Court. Charlie Pickle, GI Candidate for Register of Deeds. Prologue. In Search of History. Yes, we broke the law, and so did George Washington. Felix Herod. August 2, 1946. I can only tell you half the story. Bill Downs delivered the first live broadcast from Normandy Beach and traveled with liberating armies through France and Germany. The CBS correspondent, one of Edward R. Murrow's boys, had covered the surrender of Japan and walked the streets of Hiroshima with the occupation force. Now he was broadcasting the news of an unlikely battle amid another occupying force. Downs stood in a wrecked jail interviewing the veterans, fresh from combat all over the world, who controlled Athens, Tennessee, after a bloody battle. The young men had the stamp of combat in their eyes, said Downs, a fatigue familiar from the hard days of the Normandy breakthrough and the Battle of the Bulge. They realize they have taken a serious step, said Downs, but do not interpret their action as taking the law into their own hands. Rather, they say, they just put the law back in the hands of the people. It was a dictatorship down here, said one GI. Elections were a farce, while they were away at war. They were warned not to run for office, and to stay away from the polls when they came home. No matter what happened, the machine promised, they would win. Another put it simply, we just got plain tired of being pushed around by a bunch of thugs. They were interrupted by a white-haired woman shouting through a shattered window, Billy, you come home right now and get your lunch. Billy may have overthrown the government the night before, said Downs, but when his mother called, he went. Downs had been an hour away at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, birthplace of the bomb, for a ceremony marking the transition of atomic power from military to civilian use, to serve man rather than destroy him. He raced to Athens to cover another force built for war and converted to civilian use that returned to its previous purpose for one last fight. Bill Downs and the reporters who arrived in Athens could only tell half the story. There were legal consequences to think about. Who knew how many laws the GIs had broken with all the shooting, bombing, kidnapping, and robbery? And winning last night's battle wouldn't save them from a bullet through their window or a knife at a bar. For years, and in some cases for the rest of their lives, the men who fought the Battle of Athens kept their mouths shut. Their successful armed rebellion is without precedent since the American Revolution. I wanted to know the other half of the story. Many had tried to get it without success. Reporters descended on this county seat between Knoxville and Chattanooga in the days after the battle, and it was front-page news in every corner of the country, and from Buenos Aires to Berlin to Tokyo. One of these reporters was Theodore White, wartime China correspondent for Time. Months earlier, he'd been brought home by publisher Henry Luce for his refusal to write a cover story glorifying Chiang Kai-shek, a man he considered a tyrant. White rented a sunless apartment on East 29th Street to write a book about what he saw in China, 1 billion people who are tired of the world as it is, in such terrible bondage that they have nothing to lose but their chains. Less than 1,000 years ago, Europe lived this way. Then Europe revolted against the old system in a series of bloody wars that lifted it generation by generation to what we regard as civilization. The people of Asia are now going through the same process. The pages rolled off the typewriter. Thunder Out of China was selected for the Book of the Month Club. If it never sold another copy, he'd earn 10 times the annual salary of the average American. Upon hearing the news, White left his New York apartment and bought his first automobile. He drove south to Washington, where he aimed his car at the heart of the country and headed west. There must be stories out there, he thought. White's car climbed out of the Shenandoah Valley and crossed into the hills of Tennessee, where he heard reports of the battle. He headed for Athens. "You want to know how this started, eh?" said Jim Buttram, campaign manager for the GI ticket, a high school football star who had been wounded in France. "Well, all of us did a lot of thinking over there about the disgraceful way this gang was abusing our people here. When we got back, a group of us got together last December and decided we couldn't stand for this to go on." "Sheriff Pat Mansfield said he was going to give us a fair and square election," said Otto Kennedy, bail bondsman, tire store owner, and chairman of the local Republican Party. "And then we have those sons of bitches walking around with their guns and badges telling us to kiss their ass." This became "kiss our neck" somewhere between the interview and publication. Ralph Duggan, a genteel Athens lawyer and strategist for the GIs, spent long nights in Pacific waters worried more about his home than the Axis military machine. If democracy was good enough to put on the Germans and Japanese, he said, it was good enough for McMinn County. But nobody would talk about what everyone really wanted to know. "From dusk to dawn," wrote White, "the story of the siege of Athens dissolves into anonymity. No man knows or tells who played precisely what role on the night of Thursday, August 1, 1946. White submitted his story, The Hearts and Votes of McMinn County, to Harper's. It ran under a new title, one that would forever give this event its name, The Battle of Athens, Tennessee. He went on to national fame for his books on presidential elections, but in his memoir, In Search of History, he still remembered Athens, the last whiplash curl of violence from World War II, as his first lesson in American politics. There was little reason to think that I could do better than Theodore White or any number of others who had tried to tell the story of this unlikely revolution. The challenge was to recreate events that were purposely concealed by people who are no longer alive. If I fell short, I would find myself in good company. But if I succeeded, I would have preserved one of the great American stories. I started with a tool my predecessors didn't have, the Internet. Sure enough, there's a website about the Battle of Athens run by Travis Davis, grandson of Bill White, a name long associated with the event. Speaking with Travis, I realized he was trying to correct the record, at least as it existed around town. The vow of silence taken after the battle created an information void, filled by people making all kinds of claims. Travis knew his grandfather was telling the truth, and in exchange for his help, Travis asked me for nothing but to dig as far as I could into the story and report what I found. He said it would vindicate his grandfather. He was right. Bill White recorded his stories from World War II and the Battle of Athens on old cassette tapes, hours of first-hand recollections that had never been heard outside the White family. Bill identified the men who had fought alongside him, giving names to the shadowy, faceless veterans firing in the darkness. I searched for each of them. Time and again, the first hit was for their obituary. Maybe their families knew something? Ken Mashburn's daughter Patty remembered her father telling her as a little girl, "Do the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing." When he was young, he explained, he had risked getting killed or locked up in a firefight with a corrupt sheriff. "Really?" his young daughter asked. David Hutzel's daughter worried that she didn't have any useful recollections. "Okay," I said. "Please call me if you think of anything." We talked almost every day for the next week as her memory refocused on old events, and it turned out that her father had told Gabe, his grandson, everything. I was able to interview him at his home in Athens. Joe Grubb was living in San Francisco and retired as an agency head for the city. I got his number from his father's widow, whom I had called after reading his obituary. "Oh, yes," he said. "My father had a file labeled Battle of Athens." I thought he was messing with me. Letters in the aging manila folder told of the war, the GI's shocking homecoming to McMinn, and the building of the Veterans Club in a hotel basement that sprang the GI political movement. Jim Buttram died the year I was born. His widow died a year before I started this project. But her passing required their children to clean out a safe they had never seen their parents open. His son Jim invited me to his home in Lenore City to see for myself. Inside were his confidential papers detailing efforts to organize and elect the GI ticket. The Ralph Duggan who greeted me at his home in Georgia was instantly recognizable as the man his namesake father might have aged into had he not died so young. His father's private papers were meticulously organized, and he gladly opened them up for me. Others never said a word until pressed later in life. Knoxville Police Captain Randy Lockmiller was working security at the convention center when a stranger recognized his name. "Are you kin to Jimmy Lockmiller?" he asked. "That's my dad," he said. "Your father was involved in the Battle of Ballots and Bullets," he said, a local name used by some older residents. Randy called his father that night. "What's this about the Battle of Ballots and Bullets?" Jimmy paused. "Who have you been talking to?" Ann Davis was a senior in high school when her father came to speak to her class. For the first time, she learned of his extraordinary role on Election Day, 1946. As far as she knew, he never discussed it again. Years later, as the mayor of Athens, she took one call after another from media outlets around the world asking about the 50th anniversary of the battle. No, there would not be a parade. No ceremony, no anything else. Tom Edwards arrived in Athens to cover the anniversary for the Wall Street Journal. "Memory is tenacious in these parts," he wrote. Despite a half-century's intervention, people wanted nothing to do with it. Edwards recorded one longtime friend saying to another, "You know, your father tried to kill my grandfather." How could these two live with each other unless they put it far out of their minds? One official after another told Edwards, "I'd lose my job if they knew I was talking to you." Edwards's article was titled, "Gun-Shy. Legacy of 1946 Battle Makes Town Uneasy." But Athens would be remembered in spite of itself. I found a master's thesis from 1948 at Emory University. The author, George Brassington, who went on to a long career as a professor at his alma mater, had traveled to Athens and interviewed people who never spoke to anyone else. I found it on the shelves, dusty, typewritten, where it had sat for more than 70 years. I first traveled to Athens in December 2018. The McMinn County Living Heritage Museum, which had opened an exhibit on the battle only 2 months earlier, has a Battle of Athens box filled with scrapbooks and newspaper clippings. Reporters from Chattanooga and Knoxville had been on the scene, furiously scribbling in notepads, while bullets bounced in every direction. Also in the box was a letter from Tennessee History Quarterly, rejecting an article by Thomas Baker, a professor at Tennessee Wesleyan College. I called Tennessee History Quarterly and was almost embarrassed to ask, did they have a submission from 1969? Their files from that era are housed at the Tennessee State Archives. I would have to contact them. I sent an email, expecting nothing. I had the article the next day, 41 pages of original research and interviews with key participants. Congressman John Jennings had waged a fight for fair elections. He told newspapers that he had submitted to the Department of Justice sworn evidence of wholesale fraud, force, and theft in McMinn County. Deep in the shelves of the National Archives are big boxes filled with dusty manila folders, and inside are hundreds of pages of letters and affidavits from the people of McMinn describing terrors more fitting of our World War II adversaries than the United States. I was the first person ever to request these files. The Attorney General of the United States described them as the worst allegations of voter fraud ever brought to the Department of Justice. Then there were court records. In the McMinn County Circuit Court, the Federal Eastern District of Tennessee, and the State Supreme Court, with pleadings, depositions, and other testimony, preserving details that otherwise would have been long forgotten. There were 2 live broadcasts of the battle, one from Chuck Redfern at the local station, and another from Alan Stout and Bill Larkin of Knoxville. Redfern's broadcast has been lost to time. Johnny Perkle, who became a legendary broadcaster from the area, was a young boy glued to the radio the night of the battle. As a WROL intern in the 1960s, he found the original acetate recordings of Stout's broadcast. Some of these were still in condition to share the night we met for barbecue on Congress Parkway. There was the voice of Alan Stout, telling the story in real time, with bombs and bullets exploding in the background. Otto Kennedy, who as chairman of the Republican Party led the wartime opposition to the machine, had died in 1988. But I found his granddaughter, Donna Cagle, a retired teacher in Athens. She had brought her grandpa to speak to her class in 1983 about the events surrounding the battle, and she taped every word. For every breakthrough, there was at least one setback. There are 2 documentaries on the battle, one by Ross Bagwell, who'd gotten his start as a producer on Howdy Doody, and another by the McMinn County Living Heritage Museum. Bagwell had financed the project at a loss, he told me, to keep the story alive. He promised all the raw footage he could find, which tragically turned out to be none. Nearly every person in the credits has heard from me, to no avail. The museum, however, had its uncut footage, yielding hours of eyewitness interviews. Larry Eaton runs the most popular Facebook group in McMinn County and let me use it for whatever I needed. There is only one picture of the battle itself. Nobody's face is visible. But in the immediate aftermath is a famous photo, snapped at the second a hated deputy had his throat cut while being guarded by a GI. I posted it in Larry's group, asking if anyone recognized the other man. I immediately heard from his grandson, who put me in touch with his son. The newspapers published a list of everyone admitted to the hospital on August 1 and 2, a popular item in the days before privacy laws. I tracked down every name, confident that if you were shot, stabbed, or assaulted in Athens on these dates, it was connected to the battle. The wartime experience of these young men is a critical part of the story. In addition to his cassette tapes, Bill White sat for an oral history with the University of Tennessee. On another occasion, he was among the McMinn County veterans interviewed for the 50th anniversary of World War II. His interviewer was none other than Paul Wilson, grandson of Paul Cantrell, the politician who had been overthrown in the Battle of Athens. I met with Paul Wilson my first day in Athens. He and Bill White were longtime friends, and in fact many of the men involved in the battle were among the most important friendships of his life. I began to sense that the story of the aftermath, how the community came back together, was as compelling as the battle. I am confident I followed every lead as far as I could. For instance, in Jim Buttram's private safe was a letter from a Paul Frechner of Buffalo, New York, a veteran and graduate student who asked some very interesting questions. Whether the media omitted any significant detail, how the GI ticket came together, how the Cantrell machine operated. If Buttram responded, I wanted to read it. Unlike many of the people I sought out for this book, Paul Frechner wasn't hard to find. But like most of the people I wanted to talk with, he was gone. His obituary gave me the name of his wife, who had since passed, and 3 daughters, one of whom I found on Facebook. I shared the letter with her and asked if she had the reply. Neither she nor her sisters had the letter, if Buttram ever sent it. But sharing with them a letter from a father they lost in 1986 was a heck of a consolation prize. I had many such opportunities in the course of this research. Bill White's presence looms large in the home that he shared with his wife Jean, though he's been gone 13 years. Pictures and plaques on the wall reflect his time in the Marine Corps. Bill and Jean had owned a hunting and fishing lodge in the mountains. The lodge and its proprietor had drawn the interest of journalists over the years. Jean shared some old articles with me. Bill White is the kind of man John Wayne would have looked up to, wrote the Memphis Commercial Appeal. The reporter marveled at Bill's gun collection. You name the war, he'll show you the gun which helped win that war, from Revolutionary flintlocks to Civil War rifles, and give you as thorough a history on it as you have time for. A magazine headline wondered, what kind of man would hunt wild hogs with a spear? An article titled, Tennessee's Tough Guy, concluded, there's a lot of Indian left in Bill White, perhaps the most unusual hog hunter of modern times. You might call him a bit crazy, but you'd better not say that to his face. I read the interview. Tennessee Russian boars are the most vicious game animals in the United States, Bill said. A hunter would rather pit his dogs against 5 bears than 1 pig. The hunter has only 1 chance. Then it's the pig's turn. There was a picture of Bill with a 400-pound hog. The curved, razor-sharp tusks and 4-inch teeth could rip open someone from bowel to brisket with 1 shake of its head, Bill said. The magazine noted that people would pay top dollar to hunt with Bill and asked if he was available. Bill preferred to hunt alone, but promised to find a guide for anyone who asked. Jean told me that she'd first seen Bill White while working as a ticket taker at the Strand Theater. "Who is that?" she asked the boy she was working with. "That's Bill White," said her co-worker. "I'm going to marry him," Jean said. Her co-worker laughed, aware of Bill's rough reputation. "He'll never get married." Jean told me she had a strong intuition about certain things in her life, and that when it spoke to her, it was never wrong. Sure enough, years later, they met, and he asked her out. Jean told her father. "Is that the Bill White who was in the Battle of Athens?" he asked, concerned. They wound up eloping over the border to Georgia. Despite her father's misgivings, the marriage produced 4 children and lasted 57 years, to the end of Bill's life. I asked her, what would Bill White want me to write about the Battle of Athens? "The truth," his widow said without hesitation. "The exact truth." 1. Home Sweet Home. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, September 24, 1945. Bill White had survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Now all that remained was a separation interview with Lieutenant F.L. Dixon, who rattled off a series of questions as he banged away on a typewriter. The form called for basic information: race, white, sex, male, the date he had joined, 12 January 1942, the fake birth date he had used, 4 May 1923, and his time overseas, years 2, months 4, days 11. The Marines wanted to know where they were sending him: 401 South Hill Street, Athens, Tennessee. And, finally, why? It was home, Bill said. It was a long bus ride before familiar tall trees and rolling green fields came into view. The sign made it official. Welcome to Athens, the friendly city. The clock tower appeared, followed by the rest of the grand old courthouse. Every train car and coach in America was crowded with men coming home from war. They were returning from jungles, fields, the desert, and ships surrounded by water, but they all shared the dream of going home. Someday, when the war was over, they would resume their interrupted lives. The courthouse square was filled with life when the weather permitted. People gathered to sell, shop, gossip, play music, or hear itinerant preaching. But Bill could see it was mostly empty, except for some leafless maple trees. 4 sheriff's deputies wearing gold badges and guns were there to meet the bus at the dilapidated depot. They arrested a group of Bill's fellow passengers, still wearing their uniforms, for public drunkenness. They'd had a few beers to celebrate being alive, but far from enough to intoxicate a Navy sailor. "What's going on?" Bill asked a bystander. "Those deputies meet every bus and every train, and if you're drinking a beer or anything, they're arresting you and making you pay a fine." Bill couldn't believe it. These boys had risked their lives, and now they were headed to jail and about to lose their mustering out pay to a bunch of thugs? "Hellfire," Bill said. 2. On the Little Tennessee River, 1924 to 35. "I was born on the Little Tennessee River," remembered Bill White, with the sweetness and reverence he reserved for little else, which flowed down out of the Cherokee Mountains. His parents, Ed and Elizabeth White, had 3 boys followed by 3 girls. Bill found it easy to get lost among his siblings, especially Ed Jr., his faster and stronger older brother. Bill bristled under any kind of authority and was known to hide all night in the woods rather than face discipline. But he had a special connection with Grandpa Wiggins, with whom he spent as much time as he could. "Those years were real good years," said Bill, "because my grandpa taught me a whole lot about hunting and trapping and fishing, and I admired and respected him." Grandpa Wiggins led Bill on summertime treasure hunts for arrowheads, spear points, bone needles, and effigy pottery. These were left over from the Cherokee, he explained, who had lived in these mountains and along the river for many years, and Bill was descended from them through his great-grandmother. Bill learned the legends of his ancestors, like Atagahi, the Lake of the Wounded, hidden somewhere in those mountains, where injured animals could be restored to health by drinking the water. It was said that some Cherokee hunters found the lake by following a wounded animal, but once they left, could never find it again, though some looked for the rest of their lives. Bill also learned about his family on his father's side. His relative James White had fought in the American Revolution and founded the city of Knoxville. White had served as a senator in the rogue government of Franklin, a failed attempt to form a new state from the western counties of North Carolina. The Cherokee considered James White a man of honor, and he had twice prevented outbreaks of violence along the frontier. Grandpa Wiggins and Bill sat on the banks of the Little Tennessee River and waited for catfish, buffalo fish, and trout. Supposedly the duckwa lived in those waters, a fish large enough to swallow a man. It especially liked to eat boys who walked too close to the water's edge. At least that's what Grandpa Wiggins said. Grandpa would take Bill plumb over across the mountain to Bass Dockery's house when he wanted some whiskey. Bass had lost an arm in a shootout, and Bill helped him fire up the still and fed it with firewood. Bass let little Bill take a sip, sending him running to the spring behind the house to calm his mouth. Bill and his grandpa built traps for rabbits and wild hogs. They rode 12 miles to the mill to grind corn and flour, and the same distance home to make cornbread and biscuits. Sunday mornings were for the First Baptist Church in the mountain town of Toccoa, where Bill's parents had met. "People called it a Great Depression," said Bill, "but we didn't have much to begin with. We lived about the same as our families had for the last 150 years, just off the land. We were happy. We didn't know we were poor until somebody out of the city came out here and told us we were poor people." Bill once came across a tombstone in the woods, bushwhacked on Steer Creek Road while cradling oats. He asked Grandma Wiggins about it. The bushwhackers were a gang of rough men who'd been hired to defend a nearby plantation. After the Civil War, they ran roughshod over the mountains, raiding farms, stealing cattle, and killing anyone in their way. His grandma told Bill that they'd murdered her brother, a Union veteran.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?